This talk is really about what's happened in the last year or so since OpenChain became an ISO standard. For context, if you've seen the annual report of 2020, last year was a very interesting year for Linux Foundation, with the Joint Development Foundation and open standards communities collaborating on how open source and standardization can work very well together. The first project with a specification that engaged with the Joint Development Foundation to go through something called the JTC1 publicly available specification process is OpenChain. And that's the project that I lead as a general manager and which has been active around the world for several years. OpenChain was granted ISO IEC status as 5230-2020 in December of last year. So we're just shy of 1 year to market. And the OpenChain project maintains this specification, the community around it, and so on. In case you're not familiar with OpenChain or you haven't looked at it for a while, we're going to have a very brief refresher. The OpenChain project is all about having a supply chain where open source is trusted and consistent from a compliant perspective. OpenChain has a specification that defines the inbound, internal, and outbound process inflection points for an organization addressing open source license compliance. And the goal is to have various organizations in the supply chain utilize this specification, and then we link up the supply chain with the key requirements of quality open source compliance programs. Simple concept, and it's one we've been executing towards for quite a few years. So OpenChain got started with global work groups and specification work groups and conformance work groups in early 2016. And a lot of work was done in building the specification, in working out how people could use it, and also working out what type of activities would be necessary to support it regarding reference material and so on. As the specification was drafted and matured, as we saw more market adoption, as we saw more engagement with it as a de facto standard, we built out industry and area-specific work groups for the international community, such as automotive, tooling, education, and telecommunications most recently. Now, OpenChain as a project maintains a very strong international footprint, and in particular, one of the strengths we've had is global coverage in key areas where we need to do things like use other languages. For example, OpenChain has a very strong presence in Asia, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, India. It also has a strong presence in Germany. Local work groups in these geographies operate in the local languages and provide a bridge between what's happening there and what's happening globally. The community spirit of OpenChain has always been very intense. We've had a great engagement around the world from all types of stakeholder. And as time went by, from 2016 to present, that only increased. Of course, we were slightly hindered with the global pandemic for the last 2 years, and we couldn't do these face-to-face meetings, except in China, where they resumed earlier this year. But we continued with calls like this, and it's been pretty productive, even with the hindrance of not being in person. So OpenChain has lots of global activity in terms of work groups, it's got local work groups, it's got lots of people, but what is it actually accomplishing? When it comes to having a standard for open source license compliance, what really matters is the realization of that potential. What have we been doing in this year since we became an ISO standard? Well, we've had a lot of conformance announcements from very large companies. For example, in December last year, just after we had the grant from ISO regarding our standard transitioning from de facto to formal, we had Toyota as the first conformant organization, and very quickly after that, Cisco and NTT Data Italy. And that has continued through this year, with Microsoft, of course, helping to start the year with a great conformance announcement, and Hitachi with them, and LG very shortly afterwards. Moving towards the middle of the year, we had some interesting market activities. For instance, one of the parts of Fujitsu based in China announced conformance, helping to inspire activity in that market. Bosch announced not just OpenChain conformance, but their intent to have their whole entity conformant rather than just a program, making them the second company in the world to do so after ARM. Samsung Electronics, we've had Sony Semiconductor, we've had Woven Planet, which is essentially a new company spun out of Toyota for very advanced technological research around mobility. We've had Quanta Cloud Technology on the data center front, and so on. SK Telecom very recently, NEC just a few days ago, and interestingly, Eclipse Foundation a couple of weeks ago. All of these large announcements have been very useful for building momentum for the project and building interest, which supports our other activities. Of course, there's a lot of small companies adopting OpenChain as well. Some examples, Kuntech, Kitaro, and ComputerMind. And other stuff is happening as a consequence of the momentum we've built. For example, Scania, the automotive company based in Sweden, which is part of Volkswagen Group, recently included OpenChain and also our sister project SPDX in a Scania corporate standard, number 4589, which is now part of their procurement cycle. That kind of momentum, I think, is indicative of the realization of the potential we have. And it does show that the forward momentum around the supply chain coalescing on the industry standard for open source license compliance is positive. Now, to help people utilize something like this standard, it's required to provide information to support them. And of course, our work groups with face-to-face meetings are very useful, but there are other things we need to do, and we do. For example, we have self-certification materials, such as a questionnaire available online in 12 languages. We have extensive reference materials, such as reference training material, reference open source policy templates, reference automation slides to guide people in that field. And on GitHub, our huge corpus of knowledge is consolidated in multiple languages, containing over 1,000 documents if people want to dig that deep. Everything apart from the case studies is under CC0, effectively public domain, so people can use it for any purpose whatsoever, and of course not just for OpenChain conformance, but any aspect of improving processes related to conformance or adjacent fields. Now, we've tried to make sure that we are very much on market activity, that we're very responsive to what's happening. So one thing we did this year was make a special supplier education pack in 8 languages, which allows a customer company to send one email with one attachment to their suppliers and get them up to speed on what is open source, what is OpenChain as a standard around compliance, how to use it, and how to become conformant. This has been, I think, a direct response to market demand, and we've been pretty happy with how it's gone through the supply chain so far. We've also addressed things like security. For example, in August, we released a security assurance reference guide, which essentially shows companies how this ISO standard, which is focused on open source license compliance, can be applicable in the field of security. How does that work? And this has been, I think, one of our breakout hits, and we've had a lot of engagement from our community and beyond with regards to the utility of this. The reason for that is that a lot of people were already using OpenChain to help address security issues, because the process points that we identify, inbound, internal, and outbound, regarding the identification of software and its licenses, are equally applicable to the domain of security. We have a lot of material getting ready. For example, right now, we're in the middle of editing the OpenChain playbooks, and these are designed to provide case studies for example, small, medium, and large companies regarding how they would go from looking at the standard and looking at our reference material and actually implementing. These playbooks are just like the supplier pack in response to market demand. We don't want to be prescriptive. We don't want anyone to read them and think, oh, I have to do it this way. But we were getting feedback from the supply chain that companies needed inspiration to bridge the gap from not conformant to conformant. And the simple existence of reference material alone wasn't enough to lift them through the process. One exciting thing about building these playbooks has been that we make personas which can be relatable across the industry and across cultures. And in doing so, and by soliciting feedback from our community, hopefully we're creating conceptual figures that can be utilized by our playbooks today and by other reference material in the future. There's more. We're just finishing a course in collaboration with LF Training, an introduction to open source license compliance management, and that will hopefully, just like the playbook, be out very shortly. Indeed, all being well, December 16th at the Open Compliance Summit. And in 2022, we're getting ready for a secondary course which delves deeper into license compliance management. Not sure exactly when that'll be out, but as soon as we can. Delving back into the OpenChain community and who's there, what's going on, what type of momentum. In case you're not familiar with our board members, here they are. And you can see the diversity in play is quite remarkable. Everything from silicon to automotive to cloud to consumer electronics and pretty much everything in between. This diversity in our Platinum membership, our board members, is also reflected in the larger community. We have approximately 1,000 companies, as best we can tell, engaging with us at one level or another around the world. And they are from a very diverse set of sectors indeed. We have everything from commodity and consumable companies through to defense companies engaging. And we're very heartened by the fact that we are truly international in our board and our community. We've had some really exciting Platinum membership growth this year. Ericsson and Huawei have both joined our board. Of course, they share some things in common, such as deep expertise and interest in networking technology. They also share an interesting commonality in that in their respective geographies, they invest a lot of time in expertise around open source. They've certainly bolstered a particular area regarding infrastructure that we're very glad to have more knowledge about and to be able to provide reference material to and learn from. Our board, as you can see from the last slide, is already quite big, 21 members. But there's a lot of interest, so there's a lot of demand pull regarding board membership on OpenChain. And at the moment, there's membership discussions with one Chinese, one Japanese, and one American multinational. Naturally, this provides the pleasurable potential issue of having so many board members that we don't know what to do. But our board, I must say, is extremely well aligned. OpenChain operates like an oil tanker. We're going in a direction, consensus is good, collaboration is high, and we're essentially working like a smooth, well-oiled machine. And for that reason, the large board works. In fact, it's to our benefit. Apart from having a diverse board, apart from having a diverse group of user companies involved in OpenChain, we do have a lot of support infrastructure around the world. So OpenChain has got partners spread, I suppose, fairly evenly across major geographies. And these partners provide various different types of service. As you'd expect, in aggregate, their coverage, because not all of them are bound by borders, the aggregate coverage is that wherever you are in the world, one of the partner companies can provide their services to you. And that, of course, was a key target for us in this year of being an ISO standard to make sure the foundation was strong for support. We have a bunch of law firms, naturally, given that this is a compliance field. The most recent is Marx & Clerc in France, which helped cover a geography where we had multinational support in it, but no one on the ground, so to say, and now we do. We've got all types of service providers, from Wipro to PwC, through the smaller entities around like Fossilware. And of course, we have some companies that you'll be very familiar with from the pure compliance side, like OSADL, and from very large international engagement like Hitachi Solutions. We have pretty much all of the major vendors of automation and tooling in the open source and security space engaged with us. The current vendor list is on the screen right now. And we also have a rather wide range of third-party certifiers. So we have certifiers based in multiple geographies, and all of these certifiers are able to provide certification around the world. Of note, I would point out that we've had some great collaboration with PwC. Their German office is managing the relationship but providing it globally. We've had a very exciting development, most recently welcoming CAICT, an entity directly under the Chinese Ministry of Trade. And we're rather glad to be able to say that due to the CAICT relationship, the Chinese government is now an OpenChain certifier. Rather big step for us in the field, and particularly aligned with recent messaging. You may have seen 2 weeks ago that the Chinese government instructed the financial sector to use open source, respect IP, and engage with global projects. Which brings us to relationships beyond business. So early this year, and in process last year, we had engagement in Japan with the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. And essentially, they included OpenChain and SPDX, our sister project, inside their guidance regarding open source policy for the government and also for the broader industry. And while you might not read Japanese, this particular diagram is one of the examples showing how OpenChain works in the supply chain provided by them. We've had engagement in the US, of course, with NTIA. The minimum elements for a software bill of materials is naturally something that Kate has been very busy with SPDX, but it's also something of great interest to OpenChain. We've engaged with them, and we've also tried to make sure our community is fully informed of what NTIA is doing, why, and how it supports the executive order. OpenChain is a process standard, but to fill those processes out effectively, you need something like a software bill of materials, and clearly this is one of the central points of the current game. And China, I mentioned CAICT, which is under the Ministry of Trade and Industry. And there's another entity, which is called CESI, which is also under the Ministry of Trade and Industry and has also been engaging with us quite extensively. CAICT is basically IT, and CESI is traditionally more on the silicon side, or physical electronics. So they both operate in the domain of open source standards, policy, and certification. We also work with Open Atom Foundation, which has recently been quite active in China and serves as a gateway between industry, government, and local projects. And so what goes on? We've had, for instance, great dialogue with BSI and DIN in the UK and Germany, respectively, since we were getting our ISO status and subsequent to it. Interestingly, we had some calls where they wanted to learn about OpenChain because they were looking at new ways to engage with and manage communities around standards, and they thought that open source and what Linux Foundation was doing and what Joint Development Foundation had done was fascinating, and they'd like to learn more. And then ISO itself. Particularly, I think I'd say that our engagement with Working Group 21, the C++ Standards Committee, has been positive. OpenChain has been featured extensively in the 2020 plenary and the 2021 interim meetings. We've had a good dialogue with people there, and people like Trent and Ron are very inclusive. They want to learn from OpenChain, they want to see what the industry is doing today, and they want to make sure that future standards development is as linked into the heartbeat of commercial activity as possible. Okay, that was a bit of a high-speed run through a lot of stuff. OpenChain has been around for about 5 years, and we're in the third phase of the project. The first part was writing the specification, and that mostly happened around 2016. After we'd written it, we iterated, but getting it out the door the first time was basically phase 1. And phase 2 was taking that written standard to market, iterating on it where necessary, and preparing to get it mature enough to formalize as a formal standard. So in other words, phase 2 was all about this de facto standard maturing and then being in a position to go somewhere and become a formal international standard, which is what we did and what we accomplished by December 2020. We're in phase 3, which is taking the standard to every part of the supply chain. And that's why all of that activity I mentioned and all of that progress I mentioned is so critical. We're embedding this standard everywhere it can make a positive difference. Now, all of this activity is with great credit supported by Joint Development Foundation, which is able to take something like a project doing a lot of work around a specification and educate us on how standards are made, how the processes flow, and what we need to do as we look at increased maturity. This marketplace and our ability to work with Joint Development Foundation, our ability to build this specification, is because we've spent years working on this. Ultimately, the Linux Foundation has been running the Open Compliance program for a very long time, about 10 years now, I think. And we've had a ton of companies and a whole bunch of projects interlinked, trying to make sure that compliance was well understood and we knew what type of activity would be transformative. We've had international platforms like the Open Compliance Summit that allowed us to share knowledge and refine it. And then, from all of these moving parts, we were able to go to the next level. That's why OpenChain appeared. But this is a standard that's less than 1 year old, based on 20 years of work. Since the Linux Foundation developed with the community and with the distributions Linux Standard Base, which first started as a de facto standard in June 2001, open source has inevitably been moving to the point of maturity where things like more ISO standards that formalize well-used, well-understood, and fully mature specifications make sense. Now, with OpenChain in market, with momentum behind it, with us saying we have an inflection point here where we can get a lot done, we're now focused on trying to make sure that we optimize compliance for the future. And one example is that we're running an extremely large automation case study across 4 months. The largest case study I believe ever done in automation, to help show people, once they have basic processes in place, once they have a software bill of materials, how can they tie things together? How can they improve the speed and effectiveness with something like automation? We're showing everyone. We are, of course, influencing things like the Open Compliance Summit. This year's event, December 16th, don't miss it, has obviously, if you look at the schedule, been impacted substantially by OpenChain and its community. You'll see that the knowledge from around the world, especially our local groups, being brought together is probably, I think, the most refined, broadest coverage and most mature schedule we've ever had. And to be slightly immodest, we've blazed the trail that allowed things like our sister standard to join us relatively quickly afterwards as an ISO standard as well. SPDX, of course, was granted ISO status as 5962 just a couple of months ago. And that sort of closes one of the biggest gaps in the market, to have an ISO standard for software bill of materials that's broadly applicable across multiple usage domains. Okay, I'm nearly out of time, so we're gonna wrap it up. The OpenChain project is run by user companies for user companies. It's you doing this to make things better. License compliance is about effective, efficient, and sustainable use of code. This isn't about a dry matter of licenses and lawyers. This is about making sure we can use open source effectively, and we can use it today and tomorrow. The project will continue our mission to get support of ISO 5230 across the supply chain. And we're also leveraging our role as a thought leader and a market influencer to try to ensure everyone's benefit. We're encouraging people to share information, to share solutions, and of course, to develop new material in collaboration with us and others. The next stage is more collaboration. We have some wonderful projects in the Linux Foundation like To-Do Group. We've got ACT project, we've got SPDX, and I expect ever closer cooperation between our projects next year as we try to ensure that the whole market, especially deep in the supply chain, is lifted up to having great open source compliance management. We're wrapping up there. My final note is, whether or not you're planning to adopt OpenChain as an ISO standard, or you're planning to adopt SPDX as an ISO standard, or you're planning to refine your compliance program, or not, do drop by. We have a very large collection of calls and events. We have bi-weekly webinars that provide a way for us to have speakers and talk to speakers available to you right now. If you drop into the bi-weekly webinars, you can effectively get the same thing as we would have with a conference and a hallway track. And we keep that rolling throughout the year to keep everyone informed and active. Other parts of our project, fully open to you. We have no requirements to start to engage, and we are on standby to help you. That's it. Thank you very much for your time. My email is there, and of course you can also ask Mike or others for my information if you need to contact me. Mike, over to you.